Welcome to One Man's Tracks, the second-hand music channel. This week I finally took the time to rock out to one of the 90s most influential and controversial groups, Hole. Courtney Love and Erlandson's messy, grungy, aggressive punk rock group that formed in LA in 1989. The band helped to bridge the punk and pop landscapes throughout their original 11-year run in the 90s with their powerful and provocative alternative rock blend. Off the back of Love's dark and vulnerable lyricism and fully charged delivery, as well as her often masochistic stage antics and tabloid press that she brought outside of her work with the band, Hole left their mark on the music industry, leaving a path of scorched earth as well as a few bodies behind. While they may have influenced and inspired countless young women to pursue their voices and passion, the band burned through a number of singers, bassists, drummers, and guitarists during their chaotic and drug-fueled beginnings. Most notable would be Courtney Love's relationship and marriage to Kurt Cobain at the time of his April 1994 suicide. The band's bassist at the time, Kristen Pfaff, who had joined in '93, gotten addicted to heroin after joining the group and died of a heroin overdose just months after Kurt's death. They were close friends, and there is a ton of speculation around their deaths that I'm just not even going to get into with this video. There's also the story of the 19-year-old girl who was crushed to death at a Hole concert, and it's all just terrible, and I'm sorry to start the video off on such a downer of a note, but I feel like these details are important when starting to discuss this group. With that out of the way, I'd like to now focus on what got me interested in Hole in the first place: their music. I'd heard their name and even seen the album art several times online, but it wasn't until I finally got my hands on these that I started to understand what the fuss was all about. This, for starters, is their independent debut album through Caroline Records in 1991. Pretty on the inside. Produced by Kim Gordon of Sonic Youth, it's a rowdy, noisy, and raunchy first look at Hole, and boy does it go hard. Punk rock with little to no melodious qualities. It's loud and raw and really refreshing for the time. It's excellent, but not what I'm here to talk about today. This is the breakthrough, the slightly more accessible, the perfect juxtaposition of beautiful and ugliness, their major label debut through Geffen Records, produced by Sean Slade and Paul Courtier, released just 1 week after Cobain's death in 1994. Hole's multi-platinum grunge pop classic, Live Through This. Featuring the newly added drummer Paddy Shamel, as well as the aforementioned bassist Kristen Pfaff, Hole's second album is certainly a catchier arrangement of tracks, departing from their noisier, no-wave roots and heading towards a more standard rock with grunge and punk influences that allow some classic pop influences to slip into it as well. You can see the band starting to shift into a more melodious direction with this album that they end up going almost full bore in with their follow-up Celebrity Skin. This album may have lost a bit of the edge that was introduced on Pretty on the Inside. It's certainly softer and cleaner, but there's still some cutting tracks on here. It's gritty and still provocative with a bit more nuance and maybe a bit more maturity to the songwriting and the sound. Just a little more diverse overall in general, and it keeps it interesting throughout the track list. More of a journey rather than just a hard smash all the way through. On one hand, this could be perceived as a sellout LP, and maybe even Courtney wanted that to some extent, but on the other hand, if that's the compromise that was needed to make the mainstream a little more exciting, a little more manic, then I guess I'm all for it. And Courtney did so in a way that was so dramatic and so over the top and personal that had a much larger effect on the 90s music and just music in general than, unfortunately, Liz Phair, Shirley Manson, or even a Skin could in the 90s. And as much as I love all of those artists as well, you can't deny that Hole has seemingly had a bigger impact than all three of them. Oh man, it was a tough choice choosing to review this over Pretty on the Inside, and if there is enough interest in this video, I'll certainly consider doing a Pretty on the Inside review later on. Be sure to leave your thoughts and comments on this album down below. I'd love to hear any Hole concert experiences or your particular favorite track of theirs. For now, I'm going to be taking a little bit of time and going over this whole melodic mix in full. Starting out with the statement of an opening song, Violet. The immediate contrast you get from the lines, "You get what you want, and you never want it again," to the potently shouted chorus of, "Go on, take everything I want you to," is an awesome introduction to this bipolar project. It's simple, it's to the point, it's in your face, it's a classic Hole song that's allegedly about Smashing Pumpkins frontman Billy Corgan, whom Courtney had a relationship with in the early 90s, I believe. So coming smashing through the door and then cooling off right away to an almost folky acoustic cut with Miss World, but the chorus here is quick to remind you that even a wrecking ball can seem peaceful when it's just sitting there at rest. This song tackles addiction and image and reiterates this album's themes of beautiful on the outside and ugly on the inside. The way they manage to juggle these soft and heavy notes in the same place, this subversive place, the push and pull the band seems to wrestle with a lot of these tracks, but while they seem to somewhat teeter on the edge at times, they manage to pull it together and come out with a really palatable product. It creates this tension that is probably one of the elements that led to so many members of this band in the early days breaking off and pursuing their own interests, kind of a burning a candle at both ends approach to making music and really attacking it from all sides. And I don't think it was a sustainable practice, obviously not with the amount of albums that came out, but it really does provide a pretty cool product, and it keeps me coming back and really enjoying it almost every time I listen to it. The songs Violet, Softer Softest, as well as the next track here, Plump, are some of my favorite songs that Courtney ever wrote with Hole. Raw, suggestive, and rough enough to really rock out to. Plump being sort of more on the generic grunge side of things, but with these pop hooks that managed to slide into a ton of these songs to really grab you and hold you for the entirety of the track. From there we end up going to a track that I kind of flip-flop on, one of the few here on this album that I'm not entirely sure whether or not I like it. I guess it depends on my mood coming into it. This track's called Asking For It, and it's the "Was she asking for it? Did she ask you nice?" It just kind of ends up getting bland and a little generic after a couple of listens. There are some points here where the delivery is quite similar to that of Courtney Barnett's, and I find that to be a redeeming quality, as backwards as my mind is on that, but overall, yeah, just a little generic sometimes, and not lyrically anything crazy. The message about a woman's autonomy that was inspired by one of her more abrasive crowd surfing escapades is something that I do really give her a thumbs up for on this track, but yeah, like I said, overall, I don't know. Jennifer's Body, on the other hand, is also maybe predictable and generic, but it's got so much grit and energy that totally sells it. It's so good they made a vampire movie about it starring Megan Fox. Just kidding. One of the oldest songs that Courtney had written that shows up on this album is called Doll Parts, and it was one that she wrote when she first initially hooked up with Kurt and Nirvana had just left the town, and she found out that he'd been hooking up with other girls and she felt rejected, and so she wrote this simple 3-chord heartbroken rock ballad that says a lot with those three simple chords. It's fairly well written in my opinion, and it tells him that he'd regret not picking her, and it seemingly is predictive of what happened, because within 2 years, a year or two writing this song, she was married, pregnant with his child, and just kind of the things that she wrote down seem to happen, and it's a little scary how predictive some of the lyrics tend to be, especially on the second half of this. This passionate kind of reprise from the rowdiness of the album still manages to hit pretty hard just on its own merits, instead of with that crazy raucous delivery that Courtney generally has. Then one of this LP's most adventurous cuts comes next, titled Credit in a Straight World. This theatrical intro that's followed by a driving punk rock tempo that launches this album's second half before you get the fabulous softer softest that slows things back up again. In that next track, you get more references to witches, which I believe are representative of Courtney's self in these songs, that is kind of reflected of the media's portrayal of her at the time, and it does also seem like something she fully incorporated and embraced for this album and just her life in general. This album's signature soft melodic hook followed by loud aggressive chorus structure returns and retains its effectiveness for yet another catchy rocker on She Walks on Me that contains this album's eeriest of predictive lines. Hold me close as we both die, my ever-present suicide. Now for a grungier cut about the legal battle that Courtney and Kurt went through in order to retain custody of their newborn daughter. This one's called I Think That I Would Die, channeling lots of primal emotion. Courtney belts out in desperation, really selling this one as well. I can't help but feel bad for Frances just being born into all of this badness that she must have been born into, but I can also understand the real primal need to hold on to your own child, as much as I don't have one of my own. We get even more unfortunately predictive lyricism on the short little smash titled Gutless. The line, all my friends are dead and gone, might not be an original line, but it being written before those deaths that I mentioned is just so frustrating. It honestly makes me lean more towards that Courtney was just using these people as props in her fucked up little world. The closing song, Rockstar Olympia, is another one that I tend to go back and forth on. Is it memorable? Yes, but is it any good? I'm still unsure. Sometimes I think it's this great celebratory send-off to the album with a fun stab at the Riot Girl movement, and other times I find the Olympia just so annoying and I shut it down before this even gets started. What do you think? And what are your thoughts on Hole as a whole? They've been a fun rabbit hole to jump down with, as someone who's just got a cursory knowledge of Courtney Love pre and post Cobain. This was just really eye-opening and unfortunately reaffirming of just how prevalent heroin and drug use in general was in the music industry in the early 90s, and I'm sure it's still a problem, but man, oh man, was it just out in the open and obvious for everyone to see, and not a whole lot of people doing anything to save all these kind of hopeless rock stars. Hole followed up this impressive crossover rock CD with one more critically acclaimed album in the 90s titled Celebrity Skin. That is another one that I'm going to be picking up if I can find a cheap enough copy, not only to complete the nice trilogy of Hole, but because it's not a bad album either. Sort of the band's final transition from noise to pop with some of their most melodic cuts, and also the band's only ever #1 single with that album's title track. They officially disbanded in 2002, but had already begun to fragment in '99 without them going and being a touring bassist for Smashing Pumpkins. They go and work on their own solo albums and other projects, and till 2010 when Hole would release their, at this point, final studio album, Nobody's Daughter. There are some that don't even consider that to be an official Hole album due to Eric Erlandson's absence from it, but I still gave it a listen, and due to Courtney being in her 40s, she's definitely quite a bit raspier, but she still managed to pack quite a punch, and I couldn't help but still be impressed by that album as well. Since this, there have been documentaries, books, memoirs written about by the band members, and personally, I've really gotten enough Hole for the time being after this week of reading about them, so I'm going to be on a little Hole hiatus, but I know there is more than enough material out there for any conspiracists or fanboys and girls to get their fix. Let me know where you lie on the Hole spectrum down in the comments. Do you love them? Do you hate them? What would you rate them? You're the best. Leave a like. Subscribe for next week's Secondhand Band. Check out these other great ones over here. And thank you again so much for watching. I'll see you on the next one. Go on, take